Does it stand out in your mind?
On the morning of February 24th, 1986, inside a quiet Van Nuys condo, the life of Sherri Rasmussen, a brilliant nurse and newlywed, came to a violent end. She was found brutally beaten and shot 3 times in her own home, a struggle so fierce, furniture was overturned, glass shattered, and silence swallowed the aftermath. Detectives called it a botched burglary, the kind of random tragedy Los Angeles saw too often. But what they didn't see, what they didn't want to see, was that the killer might have worn a badge of their own. More than 2 decades later, in 2009, when cold case detectives reopened the file, a new DNA test uncovered the unthinkable. The killer wasn't a stranger. It was Stephanie Lazarus, a respected LAPD detective, and the ex-girlfriend of Sherri's husband, John Ruetten.
Investigators would later discover that jealousy may have fueled the murder, a desperate, hidden obsession buried beneath years of silence. And in a twist that would stun even seasoned detectives, she and John had been intimate again after the killing. Despite her years in law enforcement and 23 years to plan her story, she faltered during interrogation.
Or does it stand out in your mind?
How could a detective trained in questioning perform so poorly? Why didn't she invoke her Miranda rights and stay silent? How did one of Los Angeles's own officers get away with murder for more than 20 years, while working within the very department that failed to catch her? Subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters, manipulators, and trolls won't subscribe. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you're not siding with the killer. Do you think you know how investigators work? Think again. Instincts of the investigator shows what they really see when the scene goes quiet. Don't miss it. Grab your copy now. Link in bio. Sherri Ray Rasmussen was born February 7, 1957, in Walla Walla, Washington, the middle daughter of 3 sisters. Her parents, Nels Rasmussen, a dentist, and Loretta Rasmussen, his office manager, raised Sherri in Tucson, Arizona. From early on, Sherri was known for kindness and intelligence, traits her family says defined her. Sherri's academic path was extraordinary. She entered nursing studies at Loma Linda University as a young woman, at just 16 years old, after graduating from Thunderbird Adventist Academy. She worked her way through schooling, taking up demanding night shifts while commuting late in Los Angeles. And during this time, her parents showed their protective love. They bought her a condominium in Van Nuys in a gated complex so she wouldn't have to walk alone at night. She paid her father rent equal to his mortgage, a marker of her responsibility and independence. By her mid-20s, Sherri was making strides in her profession. After completing her studies, she became a nurse supervisor at UCLA Medical Center's coronary care unit, then rose quickly, by age 27, to be the director of critical care nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. She also lectured other nurses and was respected for her dedication, her compassion, her insistence that patients be cared for properly. In her personal life, Sherri met John Ruetten, an engineer, in 1984. Their connection was instant. Friends say that she was happy, excited, believing she'd found the right partner. John had attended UCLA, mechanical engineering, and worked in the tech, computer peripherals field following graduation. The two dated, got engaged in May 1985, and finally married on November 23, 1985. They lived together in her condo on Balboa Boulevard, Van Nuys, Los Angeles, a place her father had bought for her years before. She'd already built a life there, both single and then with John. Friends and family describe Sherri and John as happy, sharing simple joys like running, tennis, planning a future together. Sherri's character was defined by sweetness, compassion, steadiness, a person who cared deeply about others, who took to being a nurse not just for the job, but because she felt a responsibility to elevate care, to make sure someone suffering got respect. She was growing into more than just a professional. She was someone people looked to, trusted, And yet, against this backdrop, love, ambition, a caring family, a promising career, there were hints of unease. She shared fears with her father that someone was crossing boundaries, that her husband's ex was not letting go. But nothing in her history or character suggested violence would come for her. She was not scandal. She was kindness, rising, thriving, doing everything right. It makes you wonder, how does someone so alive, so stable, someone so caring, become the target of murder? Before Sherri Rasmussen ever entered the story, there was another connection that quietly shaped everything that followed, one that began years earlier on the campus of UCLA. In the late 1970s, John Ruetten was an ambitious young mechanical engineering student from San Diego. He was bright, athletic, and easygoing, the kind of guy who didn't like drama and never lingered long in conflict. Around the same time, another student, Stephanie Lazarus, was living in the same residence hall, Dijkstra. She was from Simi Valley, majoring in political science and sociology, known for her energy, competitiveness, and the kind of confidence that stood out in a crowd. Their paths crossed often, in the dorm hallways, at the campus gym, through mutual friends. Eventually, they started spending time together. It wasn't love, not in the way John saw it. He thought of it as something casual, late-night talks, laughter, and a kind of youthful connection that most college students have at one point or another. But for Stephanie, it ran deeper. She seemed to attach a sense of permanence to what John thought was temporary. Friends later said she took the relationship much more seriously than he did. She was the kind of woman who didn't do halfway. If she cared about someone, it was all or nothing. They were both athletes. John into fitness and running, Stephanie into basketball. She played on UCLA's junior varsity women's team, and her drive was something coaches admired. But that same drive bled into her personal life. She could be playful, even mischievous, the kind of person who blurred boundaries in ways that made people uncomfortable without realizing it. John, in contrast, was private. He wasn't one to share emotions easily, and he certainly didn't look for intensity in relationships. Still, they continued to see each other occasionally, a pattern that lingered even after graduation. He would describe their time together as mostly casual, necking, fooling around, while she seemed to hold on to something more profound, as if waiting for him to see her the same way. After finishing his degree, John landed a job with Data Products, a growing company that specialized in computer peripherals, the kind of high-tech field that was just starting to boom in early 1980s California. He was doing well, starting to build his career. Stephanie, meanwhile, graduated and tried her hand working at a law firm while considering law school. But it didn't take long before she realized the legal world wasn't her path. She wanted something more active, more defined, something that gave her identity and purpose. When the Los Angeles Police Department began recruiting more women under a new diversity push, she joined the police academy. From the beginning, she stood out. She was strong, tough, and determined, especially in the physical training exercises where recruits had to fight to retain control of their weapons. She wanted to prove she could match any man in the room. Classmates remembered her grit. During that time, she often referred to John as her college boyfriend, proudly telling stories about him as if the relationship were still ongoing. In 1983, when John invited her to his company's Christmas party, they went together. To her, it may have felt like a continuation of what they had in college. To him, it was just friendship, a familiar face in a busy life. Even after that, they stayed loosely connected. They'd meet up occasionally, 2 or 3 times a month, sometimes traveling together, sometimes being intimate. But John never considered her his girlfriend. He was clear about that in his own mind, even if she wasn't. After graduating from the academy, Stephanie was stationed in the Hollywood division of the LAPD. It was a rough environment, a test for any young officer. But she adapted quickly. Her peers said she was a solid teammate, especially on the department's women's basketball team, where she played with her usual aggressive physical style. Off the court, the LAPD culture of the time was heavy with loyalty, the blue wall mentality. Officers supported each other fiercely, sometimes even when it meant staying silent about misconduct. There was a motto whispered among them: admit nothing, deny everything, demand proof. Stephanie absorbed that world quickly. She began keeping a diary, a glimpse into how she saw herself and her growing connection to the badge. It showed how she was slowly identifying more with the department than with anyone outside it. Her notes revealed a kind of detachment, not cold, but hardened. She was learning to separate emotion from duty, something that would define her later. But even in that tough environment, her personal life brought complications. She confided to a friend that her training officer, James Tomer, repeatedly propositioned her for sex. She refused him, but the refusals came with consequences. Rumors began spreading that she was a lesbian, the kind of malicious gossip that was all too common for women in law enforcement at the time. The tension escalated when Tomer himself was accused of stealing narcotics from evidence. Stephanie was called to testify in his disciplinary hearing. The officer was ultimately acquitted, later suing the department and briefly winning before the verdict was overturned. The whole ordeal painted a picture of chaos within the department, a place where loyalty mattered more than truth. By early 1985, after her probationary year, Stephanie was transferred to the Devonshire Division, covering Northridge, Chatsworth, and Granada Hills, a quieter region of the San Fernando Valley. She bought a .38 caliber revolver through the department as her backup weapon, a standard practice for officers. Around the same time, she began renting out the spare bedroom in her condo to another officer, a sign that her life was settling into a routine of work, training, and police culture. And yet, through all those changes, John Ruetten was still somewhere in her thoughts. He had moved on. Around this time, he met Sherri Rasmussen, a bright, accomplished nurse who radiated kindness and intelligence. She wasn't just beautiful, she was grounded, confident, and deeply compassionate. Where Stephanie was intense and competitive, Sherri was calm and nurturing. She worked in critical care nursing and was quickly climbing into leadership positions. Friends would later say that John's relationship with Sherri felt different, stable, genuine, built on shared goals rather than adrenaline. Sherri's parents adored him, and he, in turn, admired how deeply she cared for people. But somewhere, in the periphery of that new love, Stephanie Lazarus lingered, a chapter John thought was long closed. She still reached out occasionally, friendly on the surface, familiar in tone, sometimes even teasing about old times. It didn't seem like much then, but underneath that professional exterior, behind the uniform and the badge, something was quietly changing, something darker, deeper, and more dangerous than anyone around her could have guessed. Because Stephanie Lazarus wasn't just another ex-girlfriend trying to move on. She was a woman whose pride had been bruised, whose identity was intertwined with control, and the one man she couldn't control was now building a life with someone else. And as John's future with Sherri grew brighter, Stephanie's shadow began to stretch. Years before, she had been part of John's college years, a chapter that, to him, had ended long ago. But for Stephanie, that story never really closed. She carried it piece by piece through her new life as a police officer, through the uniform, the badge, and the world that had taught her control. When John turned 25, she threw him a surprise birthday party, one that friends said she planned with genuine affection. She baked, she invited people he hadn't seen in months, and she did it all believing their connection was still special. What she didn't know was that John had already begun dating other women, and one of them was about to become far more important to him than she could ever imagine. By the spring of 1985, that woman had a name, Sherri Rasmussen, a dedicated nurse with a heart as big as her ambition. John and Sherri had become inseparable, and when Stephanie found out they were serious, something inside her began to unravel. In one of her diary entries from May, Stephanie wrote that she'd gone to visit John and his new girlfriend, the first time she met Sherri face to face. Just a few weeks later, she discovered the couple was engaged. Her next entry carried raw pain. I really don't feel like working. I found out John is getting married. My concentration is like -10. That night she woke her roommate, another LAPD officer, just to talk, sobbing in the dark. He later said he had never seen her cry before. Not long after, she went to visit John one last time at his condo before he moved in with Sherri. What happened there would haunt every testimony that came after. John would later admit that they'd been intimate that night. To give her closure, he said, but it didn't bring closure. It opened a deeper wound. A few weeks later, she wrote to John's mother, a deeply personal letter that blurred every boundary between heartbreak and obsession. I'm truly in love with John, she wrote. The past year has really torn me up. I don't think I'll ever understand his decision. Even as months passed, she spoke about him freely to friends and coworkers, referring to a boyfriend from UCLA as if the relationship were still alive. And then came the encounter that would change everything. One afternoon that summer, either July or August, Sherri was at work at Glendale Adventist Medical Center when she noticed a woman walk in wearing tight shorts and a tank top. The woman was confident, muscular, and carried herself with the kind of authority you recognize instantly. It was Stephanie Lazarus.
She approached Sherri and told her she was still seeing John, that their relationship wasn't really over, and that when the marriage eventually fell apart, I'll be there to pick up the pieces. Sherri, stunned but composed, replied firmly, "Your services won't be needed." Lazarus smiled, and as she turned to leave, she said something chilling. "If I can't have John, no one else will, including you." Sherri didn't report it to hospital security. She didn't go to the police, not yet, but she did call her father that evening, her voice trembling as she explained what had happened. When John came home from work, she confronted him directly. He admitted he'd been intimate with Stephanie that one time, but insisted it meant nothing, that the relationship was over. Sherri forgave him, but something shifted. She started looking over her shoulder more often. The couple married that November. Friends described the wedding as joyful, but said Sherri seemed slightly guarded, as if something unseen still weighed on her. Not long after they moved in together, strange things began happening. They'd receive hang-up calls, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. No one spoke on the other end. It was unsettling, but John brushed it off as coincidence. Before leaving on their honeymoon, Sherri insisted on installing a burglar alarm in their Van Nuys condo. She programmed the code herself, 11/23, their wedding date. It was a sentimental choice, one a friend later warned her against. But Sherri smiled it off. It made her feel safe. John left his job at Data Products for a new position at Micropolis, a hard drive manufacturer. Their lives were busy, full of new beginnings. But for Stephanie, the past wasn't done. Outwardly, she seemed to be moving on. She took side work doing security at Los Angeles Pierce College and began dating casually. A fitness instructor, a TV news cameraman. She even drafted a personal ad in her diary describing the kind of partner she was looking for. But that effort to move on was only surface deep. The truth was, she still hovered around John's life, sometimes literally. In January, she appeared again, this time bringing a pair of skis to John and asking if he could wax them for her. She arrived at their condo dressed in form-fitting workout clothes, smiling as if it were the most casual request in the world. Sherri thought the visit was strange, even disrespectful. After Lazarus left, she confronted her husband again. John brushed it off, said they were just old friends, that it was harmless. Sherri disagreed. She told him not to wax the skis, not to drop them off at her apartment. But he didn't listen. A few days later, while he was at work, Stephanie came back, this time in uniform, armed, collecting the freshly waxed skis from their doorstep. To Sherri, it wasn't just strange anymore. It was threatening. Not long after that, Sherri walked into her own living room one morning to find Stephanie Lazarus standing there, again in uniform. No invitation, no call ahead, just there. Sherri ordered her to leave. Lazarus hesitated, then turned and walked out.
Later, Sherri called her father again. She didn't tell John this time. She told Nels Rasmussen that she didn't feel safe, that she believed this woman was stalking her. Sometimes she thought she saw her car behind her on the street. Sometimes even believed Lazarus was disguising herself, watching from a distance. Her father tried to convince John to move away, even offered him a position through contacts in Tucson, Arizona, but the couple stayed. By early February, Sherri was restless, anxious. She wasn't sleeping well. She told her parents she felt she was being followed. Her car had been vandalized in the hospital parking lot. Scratches, minor damage, no witnesses. Hospital security took it seriously enough to give her permission to park in a secure lot. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. On Valentine's Day, 1986, Stephanie's roommate moved out of her Granada Hills condo. 1 week later, on February 23rd, John and Sherri had a quiet Sunday planned. A friend from UCLA had come over to visit, and they spent the day laughing, cooking, catching up. Normally, they entered through the garage, but this time they used the front door. When their guest left that evening, John forgot to lock it. It was a small detail, a moment that meant nothing then. But in hindsight, it changed everything. Because by the time dawn broke the next morning, that unlocked door would lead to one of Los Angeles's most haunting cold cases, and a story that would take more than 2 decades to uncover. And at the center of it all was a woman sworn to protect, and the obsession she couldn't let die. It was a Monday morning in Los Angeles, February 24th, 1986, the kind of morning that began like any other for John and Sherri Ruetten. The couple had been married just 3 months.
Their condo on Balboa Boulevard sat tucked inside a quiet gated community in Van Nuys, lined with palm trees, trimmed lawns, and the kind of silence that makes you feel safe. At around 7:20 a.m., John left for work. He was an engineer at Micropolis, a local tech company that specialized in hard drives, the kind of job that demanded focus and long hours. Sherri, meanwhile, was supposed to deliver a motivational presentation at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, where she served as director of critical care nursing. But that morning, she wasn't feeling up to it. She'd hurt her back in an aerobics class the day before and told John she might just stay home and rest. She smiled, half teasing, saying she'd probably just take a lazy day. It was the kind of conversation every couple has, small, forgettable in the moment. But it would be the last one they ever shared. After John left, Sherri likely tidied up, poured herself a cup of coffee, maybe even thought about her presentation one last time. The morning stayed quiet until about 9:45 a.m. That's when one of their neighbors, a woman who lived just a few units away, noticed something strange. The Ruetten's garage door was wide open, and the BMW that Sherri usually drove was gone. It wasn't like her. Sherri was meticulous, the kind of person who double-checked every lock before bed, who always turned on the alarm. But maybe she'd gone out quickly. Maybe she forgot. 15 minutes later, at around 10 a.m., John made his first phone call home, just to check in. No answer. He tried again later, still nothing. He found it odd. The answering machine didn't even pick up. That was unusual. They always left it on when the condo was empty. Around the same time, Sherri's sister, who worked at another local hospital, tried calling too. She got no response either, though she swore she heard the answering machine click on once before leaving a message. By noon, the quiet unease in the complex began to take shape. 2 men, believed to be local gardeners, approached a neighbor with something they had found on the ground nearby, a woman's purse. Inside was Sherri Rasmussen's ID. The neighbor didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it had been dropped or blown out of a car. But the purse was scuffed, the contents disheveled, as if someone had gone through it in a hurry. Meanwhile, a maid cleaning another unit in the building would later recall hearing something odd around 12:30 p.m. She described the sounds as 2 people fighting, followed by a heavy thud, like something large had fallen to the floor. Then, silence. When John returned home that evening, he noticed it immediately. Something was wrong. There was shattered glass scattered across the driveway, and the BMW was missing.
For a moment, he thought maybe Sherri had gone out, maybe to the store or the hospital after all, but the pit in his stomach told him otherwise. He stepped inside. The air was still. Too still. The living room was a mess, furniture overturned, a vase shattered, papers and cushions scattered like a storm had passed through. Then he saw her. Sherri was lying on the living room floor, motionless. She'd been shot 3 times. Blood had soaked through the carpet beneath her. John froze. The scene around her told a story, one that didn't make sense. A porcelain vase lay broken nearby, a smear of blood across the tile. The burglar alarm on the wall had a bloody handprint just inches away from the panic button, as if she'd tried to reach it but never got the chance. There was a struggle, that much was clear. She had defensive wounds on her arms and bruising on her face, the kind inflicted by the barrel of a gun. Someone had tried to bind her wrists, but she'd fought back, hard. Sherri Rasmussen had been trained to save lives, not surrender hers. A blanket had been used to muffle the gunfire, leaving holes burned through the fabric. It was intimate, deliberate. Whoever did this had been close enough to look her in the eyes. Investigators arrived soon after. The early theory seemed straightforward, a burglary gone wrong. There were signs of forced entry and her BMW was missing. But the more they looked, the stranger things became. Nothing of true value was taken. Jewelry remained in place. Electronics were untouched. Even Sherri's wedding ring was still on her finger. In the kitchen, detectives found signs of a half-eaten snack. Maybe she'd been preparing lunch when it happened. They took note of the defensive struggle, the broken decor, the glass. But it wasn't until the medical examiner arrived that the full extent of the brutality was revealed. She had been shot 3 times, one in the chest, one through the heart, and one in the face. Each shot fired through a blanket, perhaps to dull the sound, perhaps to conceal the shooter's emotion. And then there was something else, a bite mark on her forearm. The imprint was deep, angry, human. A trace of blood had been left behind, and the investigating criminalist swabbed it for testing. At the time, DNA testing was still in its infancy, years away from being the tool it is today. The swab was labeled, logged, and stored, but it would sit for decades before revealing the truth. Neighbors were questioned. Family was called. Friends gathered outside in disbelief. The consensus was the same. Sherri Rasmussen had no enemies. She was kind, accomplished, compassionate. But inside that quiet Van Nuys condo, the crime scene told a darker story. One born not from chance or burglary, but from obsession, jealousy, and rage. And while the police that night leaned toward a random attack, one person, Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, refused to believe it. From the very beginning, he suspected something different. He told detectives, this wasn't a burglary, this was personal. He didn't know it then, but he was right. The killer wasn't a stranger. She was someone who'd once smiled for photos beside Sherri's husband. Someone who wore a badge. Someone trained to protect. When the Los Angeles Police Department arrived at the Ruetten residence on Balboa Boulevard, it was chaos. The scene looked like the aftermath of a home invasion gone horribly wrong. Broken glass, overturned furniture, scattered electronics, and the lifeless body of Sherri Rasmussen lying near the stairs. To the detectives on scene, it seemed simple. Too simple. A burglary gone bad. Sherri's body told them she hadn't been expecting anyone. She was dressed in her bathrobe and nightgown, with no sign she'd planned to go out or meet anyone that morning. A maid who worked next door later recalled hearing muffled sounds, shouting, a scuffle, maybe even something heavy hitting the ground. But she never called police. She thought it was just a couple arguing. By the time officers arrived, the home bore every appearance of a surprise confrontation. A struggle. A woman defending herself to the end. There were stacks of electronics, VCRs, stereos, neatly gathered at the foot of the stairs, as if someone had been preparing to haul them out. Jewelry sat untouched in drawers. The only items missing were the couple's BMW and, strangely, their marriage license. That single detail haunted Sherri's mother. She told detectives her daughter had probably been carrying it in her purse, planning to update her joint bank account. Lead Detective Lyle Mayer was assigned the case. To him, this was a robbery that had turned violent, the kind that happens when a homeowner surprises a desperate thief, but not everyone agreed. When Sherri's parents, Nels and Sherri Rasmussen, met with Mayer, they immediately told him something didn't sit right. Their daughter had mentioned a woman, a police officer, who'd been harassing her. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. Nels told Mayer about how this woman, John's former girlfriend from college, had shown up at Sherri's workplace, told her she was still sleeping with John, and even warned her, "If I can't have him, no one will." It was clear even then that Sherri had been terrified, but to Mayer, the idea of another officer, a woman from within the LAPD, being involved was almost unthinkable. He listened politely, jotted a note, and told the family he'd look into it. But privately, he dismissed the idea. "There's nothing there," he allegedly said. Instead, the focus stayed fixed on the burglary theory. Mayer's logic was straightforward. There had been another burglary reported nearby in the same week. 2 suspects were seen, one possibly armed with a .38 caliber handgun, the same type used in Sherri's killing. The bullets recovered from the scene were identified as Federal 38J plus P rounds, a common load used by criminals and police alike. It seemed to fit, but there were inconsistencies Mayer couldn't quite reconcile. For one, burglars rarely steal the victim's car. They typically bring their own vehicle to transport stolen goods. Sherri's BMW being taken suggested something more personal, or at least staged. Then there was the bite mark found on Sherri's forearm. Detective Steve Hooks, Mayer's partner, found that detail troubling. Statistically, in violent altercations, bite marks are far more often inflicted by women than men. But even that clue didn't sway them. It was considered an anomaly, not evidence. The theory stood firm. A burglary interrupted. When the autopsy came back, it painted a chilling picture of how fiercely Sherri had fought back. She had 15 distinct injuries to her face, bruises, cuts, swelling. A distinct muzzle imprint marked her cheek, meaning her killer had held the gun against her face before pulling the trigger. The inside of her mouth was torn, the kind of damage caused by blunt trauma to the lips. Each of the 3 bullets that struck her could have been fatal. One went through her chest, another pierced her heart, a third struck her face. Whoever killed her had been close enough to strike, to bite, to aim point blank. And yet, despite all this, investigators logged it as a botched burglary. 11 days after her murder, Sherri's missing BMW was found parked on a quiet street near the intersection of Zombar Avenue and Cohasset Street, just 2 miles from the condo. The car was unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. Technicians combed through it, collecting every possible trace, a few faint bloodstains, some fibers, and 4 fingerprints that didn't match Sherri or John. But the prints weren't in any criminal database. The area itself offered no new leads. To Mayer, though, it was further proof of his theory. The neighborhood was known for petty theft. Burglars operated there frequently. Maybe the thieves had abandoned the car once they realized the police were closing in. He closed his notebook, confident that this was the explanation. But behind closed doors, Sherri's family couldn't accept that answer. To them, nothing about this crime felt random. Their daughter was strong, smart, and careful. There was no forced entry. The alarm had been disarmed. The level of violence didn't fit a simple theft. And then there was that missing marriage license, a symbol of her relationship taken by someone who knew exactly what it meant. Her father pressed the detectives again, asking about Lazarus. He begged them to look deeper, but each time, he was told the same thing, that there was no evidence connecting her to the crime. As months passed, the investigation slowed. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved on. Eventually, the file was boxed, labeled, and shelved in the Van Nuys Division evidence room. A bright, 29-year-old nurse with a promising career had been brutally murdered in her own home, and the official line remained unchanged: a tragic home invasion. Nothing more, But buried in that evidence box were small details that didn't add up. A bite mark swab, a few untested samples, and a name scribbled quietly in a detective's old notebook. At the time, she was climbing the ranks of the LAPD, respected, trusted, and known for her dedication to the badge. Few could imagine that the woman leading investigations of her own might one day become the focus of one. Years would pass. Decades. And the case would gather dust while a killer walked freely through the same halls of justice sworn to protect the innocent. It would take 23 years, a new generation of detectives, and a single DNA match to shatter everything the LAPD thought it knew about. That February morning, because what they thought was a burglary, was really the perfect cover-up. For more than 2 decades, the murder of Sherri Rasmussen sat buried in a stack of unsolved case files, another tragic entry in Los Angeles' turbulent history of violence. But beneath the surface of this burglary gone wrong was a story that would one day shake the foundations of the LAPD itself. On the surface, the murder of Sherri Rasmussen in 1986 seemed like the kind of random crime that plagued Los Angeles during the crack-fueled chaos of the era. A young woman, found brutally beaten and shot inside her Van Nuys condominium. A struggle, a stolen car, electronics stacked by the door as if a robbery had been interrupted. Detectives at the time didn't look much further. They said it was a burglary gone bad. Another tragic casualty in a city unraveling under gang wars and violence. But Sherri's parents never believed that. In the months after the murder, Nuys and Loretta Rasmussen grew increasingly frustrated with how little attention the case received. Every time they called the Van Nuys police station, they said, detectives brushed them off, or worse, put them on hold until the line went dead. 8 months after their daughter's death, they even offered a public reward for information, pleading for answers. It didn't help. The city's homicide units were drowning in new cases.
The gang epidemic had taken over Los Angeles. Sherri Rasmussen's murder simply faded into the background. To her father, that was unacceptable. Nuys Rasmussen was certain that his daughter, 6 feet tall, strong, athletic, would never have been subdued by mere burglars. The fight, he believed, must have been personal. He told detectives that Sherri had confided in him about a woman, an ex-girlfriend of her husband, John Ruetten, who had once confronted her, showing up uninvited to her office and telling her to back off. That woman's name was Stephanie Lazarus, but when Nuys mentioned her to police, the detectives dismissed it. One of them reportedly laughed and said, "You watch too much television." After the murder, John Ruetten, Sherri's newlywed husband, was a broken man. He couldn't bear to stay in their condo for long. After a month, he packed his things and left Los Angeles, retreating to his parents' home in San Diego. He took a leave of absence from work, and for a while, he simply vanished from the city. Years later, Ruetten would admit that he and Stephanie Lazarus, that same ex-girlfriend who had been a young LAPD officer in 1986, briefly reunited in Hawaii in 1989. They even slept together a few times in the following years. But when he once called the lead detective and asked if they were sure there was no evidence linking Lazarus to his wife's murder, he was told no, that it had been a burglary, and there was nothing there. Ruetten eventually moved on. He remarried in 1991. The Rasmussen family, however, never stopped pushing. A year after the murder, they stood before TV cameras again, repeating their reward offer, pleading for fresh eyes on the case. Nuys wrote directly to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates, insisting that detectives re-examine Lazarus as a potential suspect. He got no response. When Sherri's sister suggested reaching out to the famed true crime author Ann Rule, Nuys was hopeful. Rule was intrigued at first, but after consulting a retired LAPD contact, she backed out. The man told her the case was too hot to handle. To the Rasmussen family, that said it all. Someone powerful didn't want this case reopened. Nuys was haunted by the details he'd learned from the coroner. His daughter had been beaten for nearly an hour, an eternity for a supposed burglary. The killer had shot her point blank through a quilt, deliberately muffling the gunshots. She'd also been bitten,
An act of rage, not robbery. To Nels, those were signs of emotion, of hatred, of someone who knew Sherri. But with Detective Lyle Mayer's retirement in 1991 and his partner Steve Hooks being reassigned, the investigation fell into limbo. A new detective inherited the file but claimed he couldn't make sense of Mayer's notes. He told Nels there was nothing left to do. By 1993, when Nels offered to personally pay for DNA testing, a new technology at the time, he was told no. Police said they couldn't test the evidence without a specific suspect. Ironically, they already had one name, Stephanie Lazarus, sitting in the file that Nels himself had given them. Still, nothing happened. In 1997, a small chance for justice surfaced. A co-worker of one of Sherri's secretaries came forward, saying the secretary had once told her about the confrontation that day in January 1986 when Lazarus allegedly showed up at Sherri's office, furious and uninvited. But the police never followed up. The secretary died a few years later, and the lead slipped away. Meanwhile, Lazarus's career was thriving. She'd continued to rise through the LAPD ranks, moving from DRE officer to background investigator to detective. She even started her own private investigation firm, Unique Investigations. By the mid-1990s, she had built a solid reputation, known for her meticulous reports and professionalism. In 1994, she was promoted to detective. 3 years later, she married another officer, adopted a daughter, and taught at the LAPD Academy. Colleagues respected her. Many admired her. Few knew that she had once been romantically linked to a murder victim's husband. What's more, for 2 separate periods during the 1990s, Lazarus was assigned to the Van Nuys division, the very same office that held the original Rasmussen murder file. If she ever opened that file, or made sure no one else did, no one can say for sure. The years rolled on. Detectives retired. Evidence boxes collected dust. The Rasmussens grew old, still waiting for a call that never came. Then, in 2004, LAPD formed a cold case unit dedicated to revisiting old, unsolved murders using modern DNA analysis. Hidden deep inside one of those aging evidence boxes was a bite mark swab, taken from Sherri Rasmussen's arm in 1986. What no one knew then was that this forgotten piece of evidence would soon expose a secret that had been shielded for 23 years. A secret that lived inside the very police department sworn to protect Sherri Rasmussen, and one that would reveal that her killer was not a random burglar, but one of their own. By the late 1990s, DNA testing had revolutionized criminal investigations across the United States. Cold case units were being established to breathe new life into forgotten files, and the Los Angeles Police Department was no exception. Within stacks of unsolved homicides, one dusty folder from 1986 stood out: the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. Nearly 2 decades had passed since her brutal killing. The case had long been written off as a failed burglary, an unlucky moment in a violent city. But when the LAPD's new cold case team began re-examining old evidence, they noticed something interesting. A bite mark swab had been taken from the victim's arm, carefully preserved and logged. It was the kind of sample modern forensic science could turn into a voice from the past. In 2004, criminalist Jennifer Francis was assigned to analyze what was left of the evidence. She was meticulous and sharp, one of the few in her department who truly understood how DNA could rewrite history. But when Francis began digging into the Rasmussen materials, she quickly realized something strange. Several critical samples from the 1993 reinvestigation were missing. Some vials had vanished. Others were never logged properly. Still, the bite mark swab, though initially thought to be lost, was eventually found in the back of a county lab freezer, unregistered in the computer system. It was a forgotten relic, left behind before digital records even existed. Francis began testing. At first, she thought she'd struck nothing new. The blood found around the scene matched Sherri Rasmussen's rare blood subtype, clearing up a decades-old misconception that 2 people had bled during the struggle. Every drop belonged to Sherri. Then came the breakthrough. The DNA from the bite swab revealed a startling truth. The saliva belonged not to a man, but a woman. It was an anomaly that shattered the original burglary theory. Female offenders were rare in violent break-ins, and even rarer in murders involving physical domination and gunfire. Whoever had bitten Sherri wasn't a burglar at all, she was the killer. Francis reviewed the entire case file, trying to understand who that woman could be. Buried in the notes, she spotted a line about a third-party female who had allegedly harassed Sherri at her home and workplace before the murder. She assumed it referred to a disgruntled nurse or jealous acquaintance. But when she brought her findings to her supervising detective, his reaction was unsettling. "Oh, you mean the LAPD detective?" he said casually. Francis froze. She hadn't realized the woman mentioned in the file was actually Stephanie Lazarus, an LAPD officer and former girlfriend of Sherri's husband. The supervisor dismissed the discovery, saying, "She's not part of this. It was a burglary. Everyone knows that." Francis tried to push for a deeper look, but the case was quietly shelved again. The DNA results and the truth they whispered were buried beneath departmental loyalty. For now, the bite mark had spoken, but no one wanted to listen. What no one could stop, however, was time. And time, in the world of cold cases, has a way of uncovering everything. On a gray March morning in 2008, Van Nuys homicide detective Jim Nuttall arrived at work expecting another ordinary day. But as he approached his desk, something unexpected caught his eye. A cardboard evidence box resting on the floor, sealed and unmarked except for one name scribbled faintly on the side: Rasmussen. Inside that box was a case file more than 2 decades old, a brutal 1986 murder that had haunted the victim's family for years. To most, it was an old burglary gone wrong, just another unsolved statistic in the city's chaotic era of gang violence and crack-fueled crime. But as Nuttall flipped open the first binder, he felt something wasn't right. The crime scene photos didn't look like the aftermath of a break-in. There was too much rage, too much intimacy. He turned to his partner, Detective Pete Barba, and said, "This wasn't a burglary." The two men agreed. If this had been a simple break-in, it was the strangest one they had ever seen. From the start, several things stood out. Rasmussen's jewelry box, filled with valuables, sat untouched on her dresser, out in the open, as if mocking the burglary gone wrong narrative. The front door bore no signs of forced entry, despite the home being inside a gated condominium complex where intruders would risk being seen. And even stranger, a stack of stereo equipment had been neatly arranged at the base of the stairs, almost staged. If the struggle had really started upstairs, as the evidence suggested,
and tumbled down into the living room, that stack would have been shattered and scattered everywhere. Yet it remained balanced and deliberate, like a prop left behind to mislead the viewer. Then there was the fingerprint, or rather, the absence of one. On top of a record player in that strange stack was a thumb-shaped blood smear. No print, just a clean outline. Whoever made it had been wearing gloves. But the blood itself belonged to Sherri Rasmussen, meaning someone, possibly her killer, had handled the equipment after the struggle and shooting. That told the detectives everything. This wasn't a burglary that ended in murder. It was a murder made to look like a burglary. The final straw was the DNA evidence from the bite mark found on Rasmussen's arm. A previous analysis had already revealed it belonged to a woman, not the male burglar police had been chasing for years. It was now clear. This was personal. From 4 thick murder books, Nuttall and Barba compiled a list of 5 possible female suspects who had appeared anywhere in the original investigation. They began working backward, retracing every lead, every witness, every overlooked clue. Then came the name that made both men pause. At the time of Sherri's death, Lazarus had been an LAPD officer, young, energetic, and deeply in love with John Ruetten, Sherri's husband. In fact, she had once been his college girlfriend. When Nuttall reached out to Ruetten for an interview, he was stunned to learn that Lazarus wasn't just any old ex, she was still a police officer.
And not just that, she had since been promoted to detective and was now working in the department's elite art theft unit. In the years since the murder, Stephanie Lazarus had built a reputation as one of the most respected detectives in her division. She'd been featured in local media after recovering a stolen bronze statue from Carthay Circle. She was active in police associations, helped organize childcare programs for fellow officers, and was known for her professionalism. To most, she was the last person who could possibly be connected to a murder. But to Nuttall and Barba, who had now eliminated every other woman on their suspect list, she became their quiet obsession. Still, they couldn't risk tipping her off. Lazarus was married to another LAPD detective and had friends across multiple divisions. If word got out,
she could vanish behind a wall of police protection. Or worse, destroy evidence, prepare a defense, even flee. So they referred to her only as Number 5. When they needed to review personnel records, they fabricated cover stories. They conducted meetings behind closed doors. Every late-night lead or phone call had to be disguised. Their own colleagues couldn't know what they were doing. It was, in every sense, an investigation inside the walls of the LAPD itself. To understand Lazarus's possible involvement, the detectives turned to her life in the mid-1980s. Back then, most LAPD officers carried a .38 caliber revolver as a backup or off-duty weapon, precisely the type used to kill Rasmussen. Records revealed that Lazarus had owned a Smith & Wesson Model 4938 at the time of the murder. And then came another twist. Just 13 days after Sherri's death, Lazarus had filed a police report in Santa Monica claiming that her gun had been stolen. She never reported it to her department's armorer, a direct violation of LAPD policy. Instead, she had quietly replaced the weapon a month later. Investigators believed she had likely tossed the original gun into the Pacific Ocean near the Santa Monica Pier to erase the evidence forever. Without that weapon, DNA was the only way to tie her to the crime. Nuttall and Barba now knew exactly what they were dealing with. A fellow officer who, if guilty, had committed the perfect insider crime. They theorized that Lazarus, familiar with police procedure, had carefully staged the scene. She likely arrived at the condo on her day off, confirmed by her time records.
She brought her off-duty gun, not her service weapon, knowing it would need to disappear. She used a quilt to muffle the shots and gloves to avoid fingerprints. And then she rearranged the scene to look like a burglary interrupted. It was brilliant, calculated, and deeply personal. But brilliance leaves traces, and one of them had been preserved in a freezer for more than 20 years. Nuttall contacted Nels Rasmussen, Sherri's father, who had never stopped fighting for his daughter's case. Nels shared details about Lazarus's ongoing harassment, confrontations, stalking, threats that had never been properly documented. It was the final piece they needed. Now all that remained was proof. The detectives knew they couldn't request a DNA sample directly. That would require a warrant, which would immediately alert Lazarus. Instead, they needed her to discard something voluntarily, a coffee cup, a napkin, anything that could hold her DNA. Their chance came one afternoon at a Simi Valley Costco. Off-duty and unaware of the eyes watching her, Lazarus sipped from a plastic cup, finished her drink, and dropped it into the trash. Moments later, undercover officers retrieved it. Back at the lab, the sample was tested, and the results were undeniable. The DNA from the cup matched the female DNA found in the bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen's arm. After 22 years of silence, the case had finally spoken. And this time, the killer was one of their own. In Simi Valley, just outside Los Angeles, plainclothes officers quietly took up positions near a quiet suburban home. It belonged to Stephanie Lazarus. Others waited at the nearby Metrolink station, where she usually boarded the morning train into the city. The moment had come. Back at Parker Center, the LAPD headquarters, two detectives, Greg Stearns and Dan Jaramillo, had been carefully chosen for one reason. They had no personal connection to Lazarus. They were the ones who would confront her face to face. Their plan was deceptively simple. They called her at work, saying they needed her help with an art theft case. It wasn't unusual.
Lazarus specialized in art crime. She agreed to come by. What she didn't know was that Parker Center's holding area had been specifically chosen for a reason. To enter, she'd have to check in her firearm, her badge, her belt, everything that made her an armed officer. For her, it was just another routine day. For them, it was a trap. When she entered the interview room, she seemed relaxed, friendly even. The detectives began casually, asking her about old cases, about her career, and finally, about the 1986 death of Sherri Rasmussen. They said her name like it was an afterthought, a detail they just wanted to clarify. But they were watching closely, every pause, every breath, every flicker of recognition behind her eyes. Lazarus brushed it off at first. She said she barely remembered the woman. But as the conversation went on, her answers changed. Slowly, she began to reveal things, details only someone deeply familiar with the situation would know. Mentions of John Ruetten, her former boyfriend, and Sherri's husband. Casual acknowledgments that she had visited their home once or twice. Her tone shifted. She grew defensive, then suspicious, then accusatory. Finally, she looked across the table and said the words they'd been waiting for. "So, am I a suspect or something?" Moments later, when the detectives mentioned DNA, her demeanor broke. She declined to give a sample, stood up, and walked out of the interview room. She didn't make it far. The arresting officers were waiting. While Lazarus sat handcuffed in the back of a cruiser, other teams swarmed her Simi Valley home. Inside, they found journals from the 1980s, emotional entries filled with longing, heartbreak, and resentment over John Ruetten's engagement to Sherri Rasmussen. In one entry, she'd written about her pain, her jealousy, her inability to let go. On her computer, they discovered that even decades later, she had searched Ruetten's name multiple times online. The evidence was overwhelming. The image of the respected, cheerful art theft detective began to unravel. Her co-workers were stunned. Many couldn't believe it. They described her as friendly, funny, the kind of cop you wanted on your team. Others, however, weren't surprised. Some quietly admitted they had a nickname for her back in the day. Lazarus. They said she had a temper, one that could explode without warning. The LAPD moved quickly to distance itself. The case she had been working on was dropped. Lazarus was allowed to take early retirement, but as she was booked into the Los Angeles County Jail, it was clear she wasn't going anywhere. Her bail hearing came nearly 6 months later. The courtroom was tense. Lazarus sat in her orange jumpsuit, her once commanding presence replaced by silence. Judge Robert J. Perry reviewed the evidence, the DNA match, the stolen gun, the inconsistencies. He set bail at $10 million in cash. The courtroom gasped. It was one of the highest ever set in California history for a murder case. The message was clear. The court wasn't taking chances. Her lawyer, Mark Overland, called it outrageous. He pointed to celebrity cases like Robert Blake and Phil Spector, both accused murderers with far lower bail. But the judge didn't flinch. He said Lazarus was a trained officer, skilled with weapons, and a potential flight risk. She stayed behind bars. Over the next 3 years, the defense filed motion after motion, all denied. Overland argued that the evidence was too old, that the DNA was contaminated, that the interrogation violated her rights. But the case only grew stronger. The public was riveted. Every element felt like something out of a crime show. A cold case, a love triangle, and a killer hiding behind a badge. When the trial finally began in 2012, the courtroom overflowed. Reporters filled every seat. Cameras waited outside. The prosecution's opening line was chilling. A bite, a bullet, a gun barrel, and a broken heart. They painted Lazarus as a woman consumed by jealousy. A woman who couldn't stand to see the man she loved marry someone else. When John Ruetten took the stand, he broke down in tears. He admitted that he'd slept with Lazarus after getting engaged to Sherri, a mistake, he said, that haunted him ever since. The defense tried to revive the old burglary theory. They claimed someone else had done it, that the scene had been staged to look personal. But the evidence, especially the DNA from that bite mark, told another story. The defense attacked it fiercely, suggesting it was planted, tampered with or mishandled, but the science held up. The jury listened. They studied the photos of Sherri's body, the bloodstains, the chaos of the crime scene, and when the verdict came, it landed like thunder. First-degree murder. In March 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Today, she serves her time at the California Institution for Women in Corona. Behind bars, she is inmate, once a respected LAPD detective, now a cautionary tale about power, obsession, and the darkness that can hide behind a badge. In May 2013, Stephanie Lazarus, once a decorated LAPD detective, now a convicted murderer, launched her appeal. Her new attorney, Donald Tickle, argued that the trial judge, Robert J. Perry, had made crucial errors before the trial even began. He claimed the court should have sided with the defense on 4 key pretrial motions, and that Lazarus's former lawyer, Mark Overland, should have been allowed to cross-examine FBI expert Mark Safarek about another burglary that might have supported the original theory of a break-in gone wrong. But when the appeal reached the California Court of Appeal in June 2015, the courtroom atmosphere was different. 3 judges, Audrey B. Collins, Thomas Wilhite Jr., and Nora Margaret Minella, listened carefully as both sides argued their case. A month later, their decision was unanimous. The conviction would stand. In her written opinion, Judge Minella dismantled the defense's arguments one by one. She noted that the passage of time, nearly 3 decades, likely hurt the prosecution more than the defense.
She wrote that Lazarus had no objectively reasonable basis to believe she was compelled to answer detectives' questions during her 2009 interview, meaning her statements had been voluntary. The DNA evidence, she concluded, had been properly tested and legally admissible. Even the defense's claim about Safarek's cross-examination was dismissed. The supposed similar burglary was too far removed in time and circumstance to matter. Minella's words were final. None of the alleged errors resulted in prejudice to the defense. The California Supreme Court later declined to hear Lazarus's case, closing the last major legal door. After decades of secrecy and silence, justice for Sherri Rasmussen had survived every appeal, and Stephanie Lazarus would remain behind bars for the rest of her life.
Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters, manipulators, and trolls won't subscribe. Comment: I stand for justice. If you're not siding with the killer, do you think you know how investigators work? Think again. Instincts of the investigator shows what they really see when the scene goes quiet. Don't miss it. Grab your copy now. Link in bio.